What would you do if you were punished for something you didn't do? Imagine walking home on a sunny afternoon, minding your own business, only to find yourself in trouble for simply defending yourself. This is exactly what happened to 12-year-old Larry Rogers, a quiet and curious boy who loved comics and basketball. Larry had lived in Maplewood his whole life, a neighborhood known for its peaceful streets and friendly community. He was the kind of kid who avoided trouble, always choosing to stay on the right path. But one fateful afternoon, everything changed. A run-in with the school bully turned into a fight, and when the police arrived, they didn't ask questions. They made a decision that would shake Larry's faith in fairness and justice. But what happens next will shock you. Larry had always kept to himself, never looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. That afternoon, just as he turned a corner, he heard a voice call out, "Hey, hey you!" He looked up and saw Ricky Miller, one of the worst bullies at school. Ricky had a reputation for picking fights, intimidating kids, and causing chaos wherever he went. He had been suspended multiple times, yet somehow, he always came back worse than before. Larry sighed, hoping Ricky would just keep walking. But the bully had other plans. He crossed the street, his eyes filled with mischief, and started throwing insults. At first, it was the usual name-calling, but soon his words turned hateful, racist slurs that cut deeper than any punch ever could. Larry clenched his fists, taking a deep breath like his mother always told him. Stay calm. Walk away. Don't give him what he wants. He turned, ready to leave, but Ricky wasn't done. He shoved Larry, once, then again, harder this time. Larry stumbled back, catching himself just before falling. He had tried to avoid trouble, but Ricky wasn't giving him a choice. The next time Ricky raised his hands, Larry fought back. His fist connected, and suddenly, the fight exploded into something neither of them could stop. Punches flew, adrenaline surged, and before long, they were both locked in a full-on scuffle in the middle of the sidewalk. Ricky was stronger than he looked, but Larry wasn't about to let himself be pushed around. What started as a simple confrontation had turned into a battle, and soon, it would attract the kind of attention that neither of them expected. Just as the fight between Larry and Ricky reached its peak, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Two police officers, Dan Thompson and Bill Archer, pulled up in their patrol car, their eyes immediately locking onto the two boys locked in a struggle. They didn't hesitate for a second. Officer Dan's eyes narrowed, and he barked orders as he got out of the car. "Step back," he shouted, rushing towards them. Before Larry could even catch his breath, Officer Dan grabbed him roughly by the arm, yanking him away from Ricky. Larry's heart raced, a feeling of dread creeping over him as he tried to explain, but his voice caught in his throat. "I didn't start it. I was just defending myself," he wanted to say, but before he could get a word out, Officer Dan's grip tightened on his wrist. "Are you all right, son?" Officer Dan asked Ricky, his tone softening as he turned to the other boy. Ricky, who now stood with a hand pressed to his nose, gave the slightest wince of pain. His face, though, seemed to twist into a smirk as he saw the officer's attention shift. He just attacked me for no reason," Ricky stammered, his voice dripping with false innocence. "He started hitting me first," he added, casting a sly glance at Larry as if to punctuate his lie. Larry's stomach dropped. What? He couldn't believe it. Ricky was the one who'd shoved him twice, hurled insults, and started the whole fight, yet here he was, playing the victim. Larry tried again to speak up, to explain what had really happened, but his words were drowned out by the officers. "Keep quiet," Officer Dan snapped, ignoring the growing crowd of witnesses who were shouting from the sidelines. A few people tried to speak up, some even holding their phones to record, but it didn't matter. They were all drowned out by the sound of Dan's commands and the weight of assumptions already made. Larry's heart pounded as the cold steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. His world tilted as he was dragged toward the patrol car, the murmurs of the crowd growing louder with every step. This isn't real, he thought. This can't be happening. His mind raced, his emotions spiraling. He wasn't a criminal. He hadn't done anything wrong. But here he was, being treated like one. He wanted to scream, to explain, but no one was listening. He felt betrayed, unheard, completely powerless. As they reached the patrol car, Larry's chest tightened. He was shoved into the back seat, his hands still cuffed, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was the crowd, people whispering and watching from a distance. Why wasn't anyone helping me? It felt like the world had just turned its back on him. Larry sat in the holding room, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His mother was going to be furious. She had always taught him to stay out of trouble, to walk away from fights. And now, here he was, sitting in a police station like a criminal. The more he thought about it, the more everything felt unreal. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just defending himself, but no one had listened to him. The anger was building in his chest, and all he could do was stare at the floor, hoping this nightmare would end. Just as Larry sank deeper into his thoughts, the door to the holding room swung open, and a familiar voice cut through the air. What in the world is going on here? It was Chief Bradley Rogers, Maplewood's police chief, and Larry's grandfather. Chief Rogers was a man known for his calm demeanor, his fairness, and his decades of service in law enforcement. But today, his face was tight with anger. His usually steady gaze was sharp, scanning the room, taking in Larry's cuffs and the officers standing nearby. "What happened?" Chief Rogers demanded, his voice cool but filled with an undeniable edge. Officer Dan stammered as he explained, his words rushed and unsure. "We found him fighting another boy on Maplewood Avenue, sir. We didn't see who started it, but it was getting out of hand." The chief's eyes flicked to Larry, who was still sitting in shock. Then slowly, Chief Rogers turned back to the officers, his expression hardening. "Did you talk to him? Did you even ask for his side of the story? Or did you just assume because of what you saw that he was the aggressor?" The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they had overlooked the most crucial part of the process. They hadn't questioned Larry or bothered to ask for any details before jumping to conclusions. "Well, we didn't exactly," Bill stammered, his voice trailing off, unable to defend their actions. Chief Rogers' gaze darkened, and he took a deep breath before ordering one of the officers to pull up the street camera footage. The room fell silent as the video played, revealing the truth. Ricky had pushed Larry first, taunting him and starting the fight. Larry had only fought back in self-defense. The officers looked down, guilt washing over their faces as Chief Rogers' voice cut through the silence. "This is why you don't assume, and this is why bias has no place in law enforcement. You have to listen to both sides before making a judgment." He turned to Larry, his tone softening as he uncuffed his grandson. "I'm sorry this happened, Larry. This won't happen again." Larry looked up at him, a mixture of relief and disbelief flooding through him. His grandfather was here, and that meant the truth was finally coming out. The tension in the room was thick as the officers stood silently, waiting for the truth to unfold. Chief Rogers gestured to one of the tech officers, who quickly pulled up the street camera footage. The room watched in anticipation as the video played, capturing the events on Maplewood Avenue in vivid detail. It was clear now. Ricky had been the one to initiate the confrontation. The footage showed him pushing Larry twice, hurling insults, and making physical contact first. Larry hadn't thrown the first punch. He had only defended himself when Ricky's aggression crossed a line. The room was silent as the footage continued, revealing exactly what had happened, with Ricky's taunts and actions now undeniable on screen. As the video finished, Chief Rogers turned slowly to face Officer Dan and Officer Bill, their faces now pale with guilt. They had assumed Larry was the troublemaker, jumping to conclusions without any investigation or proper questioning. The chief's eyes were cold with disappointment as he uncuffed Larry, his movements deliberate and firm. "Larry, you're free to go," Chief Rogers said, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet anger. He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, a small gesture of reassurance in the face of the unjust treatment Larry had endured. Then Chief Rogers turned his full attention to the officers, his tone hardening. "You both should be ashamed of yourselves. In this line of work, assumptions and bias have no place. You're here to serve and protect all people, not just those who fit your narrow view of things." His gaze pierced through them. "If this ever happens again, if you let your prejudices cloud your judgment, you're out. Do I make myself clear?" Dan and Bill stood there, silent and chastened, their heads bowed in acknowledgement. It was clear that this was a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire department. Chief Rogers had made it clear that there would be no tolerance for biased actions in law enforcement. Larry's heart finally began to settle as he was led out of the room. His grandfather had made sure justice was served, but it wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about teaching everyone a lesson in fairness and accountability. The road ahead for Maplewood and its police force was long, but today, justice had prevailed. As Larry walked out of the police station, his grandfather by his side, he felt a mix of relief and disbelief. The handcuffs were off, the truth had come out, and Ricky's lies had been exposed, but Larry couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. This wasn't just about one fight or one bad experience. It was about the bigger picture. Maplewood, the peaceful town he had always known, had a lot of work to do. The system that was supposed to protect him had failed him. For this place to truly live up to its reputation, it needed to change, and that change had to start with fairness, accountability, and the courage to confront bias when it appeared. Larry had learned an important lesson that day. Sometimes, doing the right thing means standing up against wrongful accusations, even when it feels like no one is listening. He had fought, not just for his own dignity, but for the truth to be heard, for justice to prevail, and for people to understand that assumptions and prejudices don't have a place in any community, especially one that claims to be just. As the camera zoomed out, Larry's voice echoed over the closing scenes. "What do you think about this situation? Have you ever been wrongfully accused? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts." He paused for a moment before adding, "If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and share it with your friends so we can spread the message of fairness and justice. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more eye-opening stories that make us think, reflect, and inspire change." The video fades to black, leaving the viewer with a lingering thought. How often do we let our assumptions dictate our actions, and what will it take for us to change?